So first, what is an annual? Usually annuals are grown for their color, whether that's for the foliage or for the bloom. That's mainly why they're grown. And they'll bloom all summer. And in Colorado, they'll die back every year at the first frost. So whether that's September or October, you never know with our weather. And there's some varieties of annuals that'll come back through reseeding. The vast majority of them need full sun in order to have their biggest show of color and flower, but some of them can be great in shade as well. And so I have some of those noted in here as well. These three pictures, three great examples of uses of annuals in beds and in topiaries. The top one might look familiar to some of you guys. That's the annual garden at Denver Botanic Gardens. The bottom is a design from HOA in Arvada, and then the Centura. And then the bottom right is a peacock topiary from Denver or Dallas Arboretum, which I just think is too cool. All right, so when designing a pot, for the most part, you're going to use a thriller, a filler, and a spiller. And I have all of the annuals we're going to go over today categorized in these three categories. And then sun versus shade. So sun plants, the vast majority of annuals are sun plants, and they need at least 6 hours of direct sun. Shade plants, I have noted on the slide with this little black cloud of what can tolerate more shade. If you put a sun annual in shade, it's not going to grow as vigorous, and there's potentially less blooms. The ones that you'll see that can tolerate some shade are more foliage based or won't bloom as much. The picture here is of an osteospermum, and I don't have this on our list, but this is one of the awesome annuals. They just have the coolest flower shapes and colors, just such vibrant colors. Okay, so we'll start with the thrillers. These are usually going to be your centerpieces for your pot. So I have three picture examples of these thrillers. Or a unique flower, so they'll take height, or just be like a really cool texture or foliage. So that top right picture, those are some elephant ears. Those do get wrecked by the hail occasionally here in Colorado. Center picture has kale and some mums. That's a great fall pot as their thrillers. And then that bottom has some, the left is a bromeliad. And so that is another thriller centerpiece. All right, so we're going to go through some of these caladiums. These are grown from a bulb. It's a shade annual. That top right side picture has a bunch of different colors or varieties of their foliage, and they are super cool. They look like an elephant ear. Can come back each year in some climates, but not in Colorado if you leave your pot out all season. So if you have a pot and you bring it in, the caladium during the winter, the caladium might be able to push new growth for the next season. And again, a shade one, you can see the cloud, the black cloud will again note the shade annuals. Okay, dahlias, these are grown from tubers. They're sold, the tubers are sold in Home Depot right now if you're looking for them. And you can also buy them as a green like vegetative state, and then they'll push at the end of the season. They're pretty fragile. They're just so delicate. They're commonly grown for cut flowers as well. If you're using them as a cut flower, they'll wilt faster than others. And there's tons of different varieties in shapes and colors and just textures. I just feel like these are one of the most beautiful quintessential flowers out there. So they're great for a centerpiece. And there's dinner plate dahlias, which are huge, all the way down to smaller sized flowers. You can see in that top left hand side picture with the different shades of like pink and red, how different those sizes of the dahlias can be. And then that bottom right picture just has a great variety of the colors that dahlias come in, as well as the sizes. Hibiscus. So the hibiscus is a tropical flower. There are also two varieties of hardy hibiscus. One's a perennial and one's a shrub that will grow here in Colorado. The picture of these hibiscus that are in this picture are not hardy hibiscus. So they will not make it through our cold winters, but they're just a nice, beautiful tropical summery flower. And most of these will be bigger than the perennial versions. So there's the Rose of Sharon is the one perennial version, and that is a shrub shape. And then the other one is Hibiscus moschietos, which is the perennial version. That one has pretty big flowers, but they aren't as showy and they'll bloom very late in the summer. Bigger leaves. The biggest name of these ones is the Hollywood hibiscus. That's like the most common one that you'll see sold in the big box stores. And then we have Cleome. This is a super tall annual. It's used in beds a lot in like the back space of the beds. So if you have a huge pot or you just want something that's super tall, this is a great plant to put in there. It's commonly called cat whiskers, or sometimes I've heard it called spider flower. Flowers at the very top of the plant. So you'll see in that picture in that top right, the 3 different color, or 4 different because it's light pink too, that it'll bloom at the very top, not throughout the whole shrub. It has a unique smell. Some people think it smells like cat pee, but it has a scent. I've heard it called bad and good. Can tolerate dry spells, but no annual is going to be a true drought tolerant plant. Like you could plant some of the perennials in your beds here. They're all going to need more supplemental watering than if you were planting a perennial. And they're a dramatic looking cool flower, just a nice unique shape to them as well. Castor bean, this one's super fun because it has 2 different fun attributes to it. So the seed pod is that circular red. Obviously, this is the seed pod. And then it has these really cool dark purple flowers to it, big red leaves, or sorry, big red purple leaves to it. They can get 4 to 5 feet tall. So this is another huge one. And then they become a tree in their native habitat, which is kind of fun. And next is cannas. I feel like these are the most stereotypical centerpiece for pots. I have these in my pots that I just planted at home. Tropical plant, large leaves. You'll see 3 different varieties of leaves here. This really nice variegated one in the bottom right-hand side with the green and yellow stripes. And then darker leaves and greener leaves. I have seen the darker leaves one be more susceptible to Japanese beetle versus the greener varieties. So just something to keep in mind if you do have a Japanese beetle issue. And they're grown for the whole plant, meaning the foliage is just as stunning, I think, as the flower. And the flowers are usually hot or like warm colors. So you see a good variety of the colors here, the light pink, yellow, reds, oranges, so warmer colored flowers. Spikes, so dracaenas, which are commonly indoor plants as well. This is a great pot centerpiece, and it'll be a little thinner than the grass, meaning the amount of space that it takes up in the pot. And we'll look at annual grasses next. But you'll see the grasses will spread throughout the whole pot, and this will pretty much, during our shorter growing season in Colorado, will pretty much stay in its space. It's been hard to get the past 2 years because of the seed availability. So it's been kind of more challenging to see in stores. And red fountain grass. So this is, you can see how much wider this one's getting in this bed space than the 2 in the pot here. These can get huge. So just something to keep in mind when you are thinking about your pot size. If you have like a 10 to 12 inch pot, a fountain grass, an annual fountain grass might not be the best choice. Maybe a spike would be a better choice if you're looking for that grassy vibe. But if you have like a huge pot, these are great because they'll take up a lot of space. They're beautiful. I believe this one down at the bottom here is called Pennisetum Fireworks, which is like a really nice pink red type of Pennisetum. And then they have these, or red fountain grass. And then they have really nice plumes with seed heads on them too. Ornamental peppers. These can be used as a filler or a thriller. I think it's amazing to walk by a pot and be like, oh my God, is that a tiny pepper? It is. So these are Black Beauty, black foliage, and then it has these purple berries that'll turn into red. So those two on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, there's another great example of a different type of ornamental pepper. And it just has purples, yellows, and red peppers on it. It's a smaller plant, so it's not going to be as big as some of the other thrillers in the pots. And it has tiny fruits, so if you want to, you can eat them, but they're very tiny. I used to work at the Dallas Arboretum, and people would, like guests would come and pick these off the plants. And I'm like, well, that's an interesting choice. They're not going to be like super filling, but they're cool and cute. Something that people forget about sometimes is using vines as centerpieces. So these two pictures, or this is some Bergia, and this picture of the two plants in the pot on the top right-hand side, there's a trellis under there, and then the vines will just be able to crawl up. It looks like a black-eyed Susan, kind of. Yellow, orange, and cream flowers, and this bottom picture of the hanging basket one of it is a good example of the 3 different colored flowers on there. And then the center is super, super dark, like almost a black hole. Super vigorous, and it needs a support system like a trellis. One downside of this is that if you do have it in a pot, so you want to make sure if you're using it as your centerpiece, you're training it to grow up your trellis. Otherwise, it's going to eat and take over all of the other plants you have in your pot, which ideally you want to avoid. Mandevilla is another vine that's great for a centerpiece. I feel like this is a more traditional looking flower, and they could be a little more expensive. It's a tropical vine, so it's usually in a bigger container. Like I've seen Thumbergia, which is this guy, sold in like 4-inch containers versus this is usually sold in like gallon containers. You could bring these in the winter and let them overwinter inside, and they could do well in partial shade, but will bloom way more often and more vigorously if they're in more sun. Again, needs a support system to climb and will need good drainage. Okay, so Pyrrhus, I love these. I feel like it looks like grass with like a high ponytail. Like it's not fluffy throughout its whole little stalk, but it has a nice little plume at the top. And this is just like a really unique, fun looking grass. King Tut, Prince Tut, and Baby Tut are all cultivars. I just think those are the cutest little names. There's also a Cleopatra. My dog's name is Cleopatra, so I always buy that one. King Tut will be bigger, and then the Prince Tut and Baby Tut are smaller versions. So that's what's awesome about this plant is that you can get 3 different sizes for whatever size pot you're looking to grow in. And these can handle a lot of water. I've seen this a few times where it's the Cyperus and then it's in some type of water, so it's constantly wet. And we'll talk about this little plant in our spillers. Okay, we're going to move on to some fillers. So your fillers are what are going to take up space in the pot. They're not really the main attraction, but they are just a beautiful addition to your plant, to your pot design. And they're usually constantly blooming. So a lot of the plants we'll go over in this section. I'll talk about how to get them to bloom consistently through deadheading, or if they don't need to be deadheaded as often. Okay, so geraniums. I feel like this is one of the most stereotypical old school types of flowers. They're just so classic in their blooming and their variety of colors. Super, super easy to deadhead. They'll just like, if you go to the end of the flower stalk and pop them, they just like nicely pop right off. They do need to be deadheaded in order to continuously keep blooming, but they are super easy to deadhead. And they do have a scent to them. I like the scent, but I've heard people who don't like it either. In a lot of these fillers that we'll talk about, there's different growth habits of them. So geranium is one of the ones that will have a spiller variety, and that's called an ivy geranium. So if you're like, I want a geranium that's going to be mounding, that's going to go into my filler section of my pot, make sure it's not the ivy geranium. And then this picture, the bottom left hand, just a bunch of different varieties of the geraniums, and they come in all different types of color, like hot salmon orange, this fun different variety of the pink, and then some whites and purples and multicolored ones as well. Marigolds, another very classic flower. I love marigolds, that's why I included them. They're also a great pest deterrent. So super common, and they come in warm colors. So there's like a cream that's a little cooler, but for the most part, you're getting oranges, reds, and yellows in marigolds. And there's two different varieties of these. They're both going to be mounding varieties, they aren't trailing marigolds. But the French is the smaller dainty flowers, like these top two pictures, and then the African variety is more thicker blooms. This one looks like an in-between, but this is definitely an African variety, just nice and big. Make sure you know which ones you're planting. I did a planting once and did not realize that someone had mixed the flat of the two different varieties and they hadn't been blooming yet, and I didn't pay attention. And then 2 weeks later I showed up and I was like, that looks very wrong. So make sure you know which ones you're planting if you're trying to mix them all together. And another great border plant, as well as a pot plant or container plant. This top right picture, that's my favorite variety of the marigold. It's a cream variety of a French marigold, and it just is like a warm, nice lemonade color. Vinca, there's a Vinca vine that's perennial and vines like a ground cover, and then this is the annual version of Vinca. Similar flower shape, but different plants. So many different colors in these. I love these because they have the nice color on the petals, but then a really dark center or a white center on these. It's just a really nice color combo. And these are a shorter type of filler plant, so they only get 8 to 10 inches, and they'll bloom all summer. So white, pink, lavender, and dark pink. Darker pink. So this picture, this top right hand picture, is a great example of all the different color options that you have for Vincas. Zinnias, again, another more common one, but still just a beautiful flower to grow. Large variety of flowers and color shapes. I think that sometimes people don't realize how much variety there are in zinnias. You have the more like stereotypical, and then you have more of this bottom picture down here, the center left-hand side has more like round pom-pom looking zinnias, flowers in there. Super common as a cut flower. This can be used as a filler or a thriller because some of the varieties can get pretty tall on these. More than 100 cultivars, which is a fun fact. And then 2 fun facts from zinnias. They attract butterflies and they symbolize friendship if you're into the meaning of flowers. Just fun, sunshine bright zinnias. And they come mainly in cool and warm colored blooms as well, as you can see up in this top right hand picture. Warm colored flowers. Impatiens, these can tolerate shade pretty well, partial to deep shade. If you put these in sun, they're gonna wilt, they're gonna fry. They're one of like the very, I'm gonna overgeneralize maybe the very few annuals that will not do well in majority sun. Pink, lavender, and orange, they like moist but well-drained soil, and they could get 8 to 12 inches in height. They're a little fragile as well, so sometimes their stems can snap pretty easily, these impatiens. If you really like the look of these flowers, there's also sun patients, which are a smaller variety of, I feel like every time I've grown them, they're much smaller than the impatiens, but they are a sun-loving hybrid of impatiens because they're such a classic flower. So people wanted to make sure that they could grow them in the sun. This is a great example of a trial area of all of the different colors of sun patients. And sometimes they could be a little leggier. I don't love these, but I wanted to include them because they are, if you love this type of flower look, sun patients are an impatient that you could put in the sun. We'll have the same look. Coleus. Coleus is amazing. There are shade varieties and sun varieties. So if you are looking for some fun foliage to put into your pots, Coleus is an awesome one that's going to have a great pop of color. They're always grown for their foliage. They have some blooms. A lot of people will pinch back the blooms so that they can't bloom anymore because the blooms are like mint. They're just like the long, pretty insignificant blooms. They're in the mint family. They have that square stem. My favorite is the Under the Sea series, which is this bottom right hand one, the green and red, and it's called Bonefish. And any type of height, size, growth requirement you could think of, Coleus has a variety for it. And here's a great picture of all of the different varieties. So never forget foliage. Foliage is just always a fun addition to have into a design, and Coleus is one of the best that's going to have a lot of different variety, especially if you have a shade pot that you're like, I want big color, but I don't know what to put in. Do Coleus. Celosia, this is also one of my favorites. They're all actually my favorites. Many different colors and shapes, and these three that look like brains are called coxcomb because they look like the comb on a rooster. And there's smaller dainty ones like these two. And then there's this one, which I'm blanking on the cultivar name of it right now, but that one's more unique and almost looks like a little foxtail on it, and that'll bloom a ton. These are also great for dried flowers if you are trying to get your flowers to last a little longer, or you want to keep them into the rest of the season. Celosia will be, or the rest throughout the year. Celosia is a great dried flower. This is one of the ones that you can pinch back and it'll keep reblooming. And this top picture up here, this top left-hand picture is a great example of that. If you prune back these bigger ones, smaller, they're not going to be as big as that initial bloom, but you'll have some smaller blooms shoot off of that. Blue floss or ageratum. I never know what this is called. I see it everywhere, and I've heard it called so many different things. My little sister always heard it, or always called it, the Horton Hears a Who plant. When I first worked at a plant place, she only wanted the Horton Hears a Who plant. This is small, grows to about 6 to 8 inches, and has light blue flowers, purplish. And then there's some white varieties, but the white variety isn't as common as the purple blue variety. This is an awesome filler flower. It just is super cute to look at, but will also not take away the show of your thriller flowers. So blue flowers.
Hey, Rachel, we got a question about coleus, and
Yeah.
someone's interested in using coleus foliage as cut foliage in bouquets. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts or recommendations about how to best accomplish that.
Yeah, I've definitely seen coleus in bouquets. I feel like when you cut it, you want to make sure it's always in water until unless you're holding the bouquet, obviously, if it's for a wedding or something. The foliage can wilt and it can look a little funky when it starts wilting, but you just can take a cut from the bottom, let it get nice and tall so you could get like a really thick stem to use it as like one of the main stems in a bouquet. And then I'd probably keep like the first 3 or the biggest parts of the flowers up at the foliage up at the top, and then strip the rest of the greenery off the sides so that you can have one singular stem. And to get it to have that singular stem in there, first of all, make sure you're getting one that's going to grow taller. Some of like the Under the Sea series, those are smaller. They get to like only 6 to 10 inches, but you could get some, like when I worked in Dallas, we had, I think it was called wasabi, coleus wasabi, which was a light green variety, and it got like 3 feet tall, and that would be a great one. But the more you pinch off the tops, the more it's going to branch. So you don't want to pinch off any of the tops to get so you could get the longest stem. Was that helpful? Okay. So lantana, this one is my personal favorite flower of all time. It's considered a weed in Hawaii and tropical regions. I spent a semester in Hawaii and took a plant propagation class, and I did all of my plant propagation on lantana, and they were like, please stop doing that. I love them. And they love heat, like hot, hot heat. So I have some that I put in my pots last week, and they really won't start growing huge and fast until they are getting that full hot sun and warmer night temps. They could be a filler or a spiller. So make sure that you are, if you're purchasing these, you're getting the mounding variety if you want it to be a filler, and then the spilling variety if you want it to be a spiller. Tons of different colors of flowers. And it deadheads similar to a geranium, where you could just go to the base of the flower where it meets the stem and then just pop it right off. I think that they smell really good. If you do not deadhead them, they'll go to fruit, which is totally fine. It's good for the birds. And they're just little black berries on the seed head, or sorry, on the flower head. And then pollinator plants, and they can tolerate drier spells than most annuals. But again, still need to be constantly watered. Dusty Miller, this is another one that I've seen in floral arrangements a lot. There's a lobed variety, a like pretty severely lobed variety, a just nice gentle lobe variety, and then a serrated variety down here. So there's a bunch of different types of Dusty Miller. I have had people say they hate this because it looks like there's something wrong with the plant. I could see that, but it's a nice little pop of gray or white in a pot, especially if you put it with like a cooler colored flower. And there's super soft leaves, kind of like lamb's ear, but not as soft as lamb's ear. But these are an awesome filler just to get some foliage in there. If you want to break up your amount of flowers you're growing or amount of flowers you have in a pot, Dusty Miller is great just to pop in for a pretty standard color throughout the whole season. Gomphrena, another one of my favorites. Cute little ball flowers, two different varieties. So there's this type of Gomphrena of the two pictures that you see on the right-hand side, and then Gomphrena fireworks are these two pictures that you see on the left-hand side. These two Gompphrenas on the right are the more like standard Gompphrenas. They're just the little balls, pinks, cool colored flowers. So like the cooler pink, purple, and white. And they'll bloom pretty significantly all season. Really nice at like just bushing up an area. But if you have like a smaller flower that you want to put in a pot as well, this will kind of like let that flower peekaboo through the Gomphrena. Gomphrena fireworks is going to be much bigger. It could get to about 1 to 3 feet in tall, whereas this Gomphrena on the right can only get to like about 12 to maybe 14 inches tall. But this Gomphrena fireworks is just another great one that you could put in that a vine can climb on a little bit, or you could just have it sporadically throughout the pot, and then you'll be able to see maybe like a dahlia pop through these guys. So this Gomphrena fireworks is super fun. Okay, last grouping is our spillers, and these are going to have natural downward growth or trailing varieties of plants. So it's not something that you have to like constantly be training to grow down. Like if you put a vine as a spiller, it'll, for example, in this pot on the right-hand side, if you put a vine and wanted it to grow down, that vine's naturally going to try to grow up and eat this centerpiece. Like you can see some of this petunias doing. These spillers will naturally just have a draping coloring or shape to them. I feel like the most common draping plant is the petunia. Fun fact, it's in the nightshade family, so these are related to tomatoes. There are so many different varieties of petunias. It's like overwhelming, but it's awesome. Spillers and fillers. So petunias are one of the ones that you could get a mounding variety, which can be good for a filler of your pot. And then the spillers are going to be the trailing variety, the Wave series. So if you are at any nursery and you're like, okay, I want a petunia to go down in my pot, I don't know what to do. They'll usually label mounding versus not, versus spilling, but anything that's a Wave series, so like Petunia Wave Yellow, Petunia Wave Red, Silver Falls, that's a Wave series one, that one's amazing. Those are all going to naturally just grow down. These will bloom all summer. You don't need to deadhead them. I worked at a place where we would literally weed eat them, which I would not suggest because it ruins the flowers a bit, but we just need to get them off the edge of the bed. We weed eated them. Large flowers. So we'll look at Calibracheas next, which look like this, but are tiny flowers. A lot of different trademarks and brands of petunias and different series. So the Wave series is a series of petunias. And they are full sun, but they could tolerate some shade. If the petunias are in too deep of shade, they'll get really leggy and won't bloom as much. Oh, we'll get to the I thought I put the Calibracheas next. Here we go. Calibracheas. So these look like petunias, but they're a smaller version. They're different species of plants. Unique flowers. These are used a lot in pre-made hanging baskets, like this top right photo right there. Sometimes they could be a little hard in patio pots, unless if you're going to use a Calibrachea as your spiller, I would suggest getting a bigger container of a Calibrachea, like a 4-inch instead of, or 2 or 4-inch instead of the 4 or 6 packs, so that it's already a little bigger than the rest of the plants. It's not as vigorous as as petunias, so sometimes they can get a little lost in the pots. But here's some awesome different varieties of them as well. This fun one on the bottom right, or sorry, bottom left with the yellow in it, and then just a nice full pot. These are super commonly used hanging baskets. And you could pinch these back to promote thicker growth so that you get this more round habit to it, instead of just a really long trailing one. Sweet potato vine, I feel like, are the most famous trailing plants. They are so vigorous. If you are growing them and fertilize and they're in nice full sun, you can have, unless your pot's like 12 feet tall, they can touch the ground, and just be this really nice full spilling habit. Whenever I had these in pots, I would have when I worked at Dallas Arboretum, I'd go in and thin them out every other week so they wouldn't take over the whole pot. Because in this top right or top left photo, you could kind of see that if you don't prune some of it out, it can take over the whole pot. So you want to manage these, or just keep an eye on that. Beds, pots, hanging baskets. And the best thing about these is if you love the look of them, but you're like, my pot needs a darker color to it, it has little dark ones. So they have like this maroon color, and then black purple foliage, as well as the lime green foliage. The darker cultivars could be susceptible to Japanese beetle. I haven't had a huge issue with them, Japanese beetles taking these over, but again, just like the cannas, something to note. And those are Calibrachea. And then Bacopa. These I feel like are not super commonly used, but I love these. And our little shade cloud, these can tolerate some shade. I just planted 2 hanging pots in my house. One of them, both have Bacopa. One maybe gets 3 hours of sun a day, and the other one gets full sun. And the one that's in the 3 hours of sun has way more blooms than the other one. Same pot, so just different locations. So it's pretty cool to see that differentiation. Blue, pink, and white flowers. These are cool colored flowers. So the whites and purples, and then light pink, and they'll attract butterflies as well. And these are great because they are kind of, I feel like these spillers are kind of like a plant and place, and you don't need to constantly maintain and prune it throughout the season so it doesn't eat the other plants. But it's just like a really nice soft flower to put into pots. Another shade plant is Terenia, shade trailing plant. Similar flower to snapdragons and foxgloves. It could be a ground cover. and pretty shade tolerant. I've seen this as a ground cover in like almost full shade in a garden as in trailing or an edging, and it looked great. Didn't bloom as vigorously as if it gets some sun, but it is a great trailing pot plant. And the foliage is like a little waxy to it, which something to note, it is susceptible to root rot. So you want to make sure if you do have any of these foliage pieces touching the soil that you're watering so that it's not constantly wet, because it could, shade and the wetness can make it more susceptible to root rot. It's also called wishbone flower, but I don't see that a wishbone, but they are beautiful, usually multicolored, and I feel like, again, a cool colored flower. Scaviola, fun little name. Fan flower, you can see it looks like little fans. This type of orchid that looks like this too, that's super fascinating. Heat tolerant, so another one that's really gonna like the hot heat. Ground cover or trailing plant, and you don't need to deadhead these. So out of all of the ones that we've gone over so far in our trailing or spillers, you don't need to deadhead them in order to get them to continuously bloom. And these will attract some pollinators as well. Another cool colored flower. I feel like a lot of the spillers have a lot of cool colors. Cool seasons. Lobularia or alyssum. This is what was in the picture with the cyperus in the water pot. It's called sweet alyssum. It smells like honey. It's just the cutest little ball of flowers. This is one that when the flowers are spent, you can kind of see it in this picture, this bottom full picture, this circle or where I'm circling right now. When all the petals fall, it is just like little tiny stems on there. But this, I love Lobularia. It's such a good, nice, and it's kind of fluffy compared to some of the other spillers that we saw are a little less fluffy and they'll just go straight down. This can be used as a filler and a spiller. Purple, white, and pink. I love this dark purple on the top right. It's a great color. And it can be used as a ground cover or border plant too. Fuchsias. I feel like these are the most famous shade hanging plant. See our little cloud. Tons of different color combos of these. My favorite is this white and pink ones, and I feel like it looks like a little ballerina skirt, the flower does. But a lot of different like bright purple colors. There's one that I saw that was like almost a black. This bottom part of it was almost black, and then the top was pink. So really cool combinations of fuchsias. This is best in hanging baskets or in shade patio pots, and it could attract butterflies. And these are pretty vigorous once they get going. Lobelia, I get confused. I mean, I don't confuse it. Lobelia and Lobularia sound very similar, but Lobelia is similar. It looks like Scaviola, but it's more of a singular flower than the Scaviola. Another cool season or cool colored flowers. So blue, pink, purple, white. Little dainty flowers, they're very dainty. So if you want kind of just like a little simple flower that's not going to be too big or take over your pot as it's spilling, these are a great option. And they can tolerate a little shade, but they won't have this full bloom like they do in these photos. Euphorbia. This one is similar to growth habit, I feel like, to the Lobelia, in that it gets shrubby and then it will trail down, or Lobularia, the shrubby and then it'll trail down. This cultivar is Diamond Frost, and it looks like baby's breath a little bit. Waxy substance when broken. So this would not, if you are looking to grow for cut flowers, this would not be a good substitute for baby's breath because it does have that waxy substance and no one wants to have sticky hands when they're holding a bouquet. Don't need to deadhead, and deer and rabbit resistant if you are looking for something that's going to prevent those deer and rabbits from eating your plants. Nasturtium, an herb that can be used for a patio pot as well. These are beautiful, beautiful flowers, I think. Really warm colored flowers. If you're doing like a theme planter, like herb theme planter, this is a great trailer for those. You can use the flowers as a garnish. And I think the foliage looks like lily pads. And I feel like nasturtium, you can eat nasturtium. I feel like they taste like arugula. I love these. Again, there's trailing varieties and some shrubbier varieties. So just be aware of that when you're picking a nasturtium. And there are some really, really unique flower colors on nasturtium. Portulaca. This is, I feel like it's not similar to lantana, but I compare them sometimes in my head. They're just like really fun, heat-loving plants. Portulaca. They have like a succulent-like foliage, and they're called rose moss because sometimes their blooms can look very similar to roses. Can tolerate drier soils, but again, if you are planting a portulaca, this should be in full sun, like 12 hours of sun if possible. I've also heard that their flowers look like, or compared to flowers, or compared to cactus flowers, the foliage looks like the weed purslane. So if you see, especially in this bottom one, this red orange flower, this foliage looks like purslane. Purslane is not a substitute for portulaca. But these are great. They will really only bloom if they're in full sun. If you don't plant them in full sun, they're not going to bloom. I've seen like garden centers on shady days that have these out, and there's no blooms on them because they don't have any sun. And silver falls or dichondra, I feel like I've seen this more commonly, and there's just something about silver and like a light pink that I think looks so good together. It's a wispy trailing plant, and it'll be nice and light as a trailer, if that makes sense, compared to a petunia, which is more of a fluffy trailer. It just kind of will do exactly this, just trail right down. Great for a different color foliage if you have some really showy flowers that you want in your pot. A foliage-based trailer is always a great option. Okay, where can you see examples? Because sometimes when you go to the nurseries, they're not always blooming. There's a couple different places that you can go to see some awesome examples of annuals. The Denver Botanic Gardens York Street has a couple different sites where they have some amazing annual displays in front of the conservatory, and then Annual Garden and Pavilion, which is in the back. A lot of weddings are back there, but behind their step gardens, I believe. And then if you've never been to the CSU Annual Flower Trial Gardens up in Fort Collins, I highly suggest. That's what this picture is. End of August or September is the best time. So they have this whole park, and they plant all of these different types of annuals to trial them to see how they do in this climate. So it's a great way to be able to look at, okay, here's a bunch of different petunias, and I can now compare all these different types of petunias and which one I want, or different types of lantana. So I love going up there every year. There's also similar trial gardens like that around the US. I know Dallas Arboretum had a trial garden like this. So no matter where you are, you could visit a trial garden. And then there's a program, it's All American Select. So if you go to their website, just type in All American Select, there's demonstration gardens across the Front Range, and there's one in Colorado Springs too, I believe, of different annuals that have won a couple different awards. So there's lists of winning plants, there's links to the demonstration gardens, which both Denver Botanic Gardens and the Annual Flower Trial Gardens at CSU are on there. So great places to check out at the end of the season, make some notes for next season. And that is all I have. Ended a little early, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, I think.
There's one question in the Q&A about soil preparation for annuals, what your recommendations are.
Yeah, so annuals will not have the amount of time to kind of work the soil like perennials will do. So I always suggest getting some sort of potting mix or some, I call it bougie soil, some like extra nice mixture of soil, especially for your pots, so that they don't have to work the ground. Like if you plant them straight in our clay soil, they're going to be stunted the whole season because they don't have enough time to really shoot down those roots and break up the clay. So heavily amending soils for your annuals, I suggest.
And can you talk a little bit about fertilizer and needs for fertilizer through the season?
Yeah, so fertilizers, what I always like to use in annuals is slow release granular. So you buy it at any type of garden store or big box store. I always find it unfortunate because they like make you buy it in such a big container and you need like 3 shakes of it for your pots. But slow release granular fertilizer, and you could just shake it onto your soil. And when you want to do it after you plant, before you water, so that you water it in. And the way that fertilizer works is that it just is like coated. And as you are watering your pots throughout the season, it'll slowly release more nutrients as that coat breaks down on the fertilizer. And you want to make sure when you put it on, it's not sitting on any foliage. You want to shake it off the foliage. Other things that I've used before, you can also use a water soluble fertilizer, especially in pots. You want to be conscientious about how often you're fertilizing because that fertilizer is only in that pot and you don't want to burn your plants. So make sure you're reading the fertilizer recommendations for how big your pot is or how big your annual bed is for fertilizing.
If you want to dive into starting your own annual seeds, someone's asking if it's necessary to pre-soak all annual seeds before you sow.
Oh, okay.
It's a big one, I know.
It is a big one. Annuals, I think it depends seed by seed. There's some that are easier to start than other ones. And there's some that are they can't be propagated by seed. A lot of annuals are only propagated via vegetative propagation because they're all clones and cultivars and trademarked. So don't propagate things and sell them from box stores. But growing from seed, I don't even know how to start. If any of you guys too want to chime in, Casey, John, or Eric, on growing them from seed, but it's very specific to the type of plant, and they usually have a longer germination rate, like days to germinate, than vegetables. I used to work in a greenhouse that we trialed a couple different annual seed starts, and it was really, I feel like they're challenging. I don't know if anyone else has anything else to add on that.
Yeah, I would say go up and do your research on the ones that you would like to start and figure out if they have any kind of pre-seed treatment requirements like cold or scarification when you scratch the seed coat, and then look at how long it will take before they can be at transplant level. Because yeah, you're starting them earlier than you're starting vegetables most often, and otherwise it can be challenging for sure.
Yeah. Besides like marigolds and zinnias and like the more
The common
well-known ones
Yeah.
to seed. But when I worked at the greenhouse, we started some of the annual seeds in January for a plant sale that we hosted in May. So,
Oh, we just got a bunch more questions.
yeah.
So let's see, it looks like somebody's asking about fertigation for homeowners, water soluble solutions being watered onto a bed.
Yeah. Ideally, you want to avoid the foliage of any of the plants getting wet, because it can like kind of burn the plants and make the flowers, especially if you like begonias, which we didn't cover today. In patients, and some patients, they're really notorious that if their flowers get wet, they'll get a lot of like mold or fungus on them. So I always suggest watering, if you are going to fertigate, make sure it's a system that goes straight to the soil, not overspraying over your plants. Just make sure the rate is at the right rate for the size of bed space you're watering. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, some of these are getting to be very specific questions. Next one is, can it be necessary to treat the seeds if you're starting them for fungal issues?
Some seeds might come with a coating that can treat it for fungal issues. It's so hard with seeds because you need that soil to be constantly moist, but then if it's like too moist, then it's also a breeding ground for fungus. But you can pre-treat it if you are going to use any type of fungicide. Just the label is the law. Make sure you're reading that, and fungicides are especially finicky about timing of use and everything. So just make sure. I would suggest not using that and just buying the plants when they've already emerged from a garden center.
And since you did talk a lot about container annuals, we did have a great question about, should you use new potting soil every year, or can you just add a little bit of new, or how do you do that side of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I leave my annuals in my pots until I'm ready to plant them the following year. So I use a soil knife, pull it all out, and then usually there's like a big chunk of soil missing from that because I'll just bring up the soil. And then I refresh the pot and mix it with the existing soil that's already in there. The other hand of that is that if you are reusing some of your soil, there's no need to dump it every year and use completely new soil. You can always mix it back in. But I just planted a pot outside our office and the soil was super, super dry. And so that I did remove some of the soil because it just became so hydrophobic that I couldn't re-wet it without mixing in more soil. So totally reuse the soil, but just make sure that you're wetting it before you're planting so that you know that the soil is going to be able to accept water and it's not just like draining all the way through.
Another great question. How can people increase the number of flowers on their plants when they are blooming?
When they're blooming?
Or how do you manage the plant to have to maximize your blooms, I think is what they're asking.
Oh, yeah. You can pinch them back. So if you have a plant and it only has, the one thing I can think of is poinsettias, because this is how you get poinsettias to have more color in the season. If it has one stalk, you pinch it back like 3 nodes down. So nodes are where the leaves and the shoots are growing out of. So you pinch it back 3 nodes, and then that's going to tell the plant basically stop growing up, start growing to the sides. And that's how you can get it to bloom a little more. Zinnias are good for that. So if you're growing those from seed and you pinch back that initial straight growth, that'll have it branch out more.
All right. And do you ever recommend adding a root stimulator or a slow release, I'm guessing fertilizer, into the soil itself?
Yeah, you could totally do a root stimulator. I used to use fish emulsions in my soil, but I have too many dogs and they were really into that smell. But there's a lot of really awesome gentle root stimulators that you can water in with. In annuals, I always suggest the granular over any type of like root stimulator or like fish emulsion based fertilizer because the growing season here is so short. So that root stimulator or the slow release is going to be able to like just pump up those plants faster for their short growth season in Colorado.
All right, it looks like we got through the questions. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Yes, thank you for coming, everyone.